On Earth podcast with your host, Jake Weaver. Engineered by Cedric Swan. Hey, everybody. We're back with Jason Scott. Jason Scott is the founder and owner of Feral Fungi, where he produces mushroom medicines through the practice of traditional laboratory alchemy. Right now we're very near, the headquarters of Feral Fungi, deep in the beautiful jungles of a mysterious place in Oregon. Jason's an herbalist and mycologist, the foundation in ethnobotany and alchemy. He's contributed writings to various books, including Radical Mycology by Peter McCoy and Verdante Gnosis, Volume 3, on the topics of alchemy and mycology together. Hello, Jason.
Hey, Jake. How's it going?
It's great. Thank you so much for letting me come to this beautiful location, undisclosed, secret location. It's technically Area 777. This is where the mushroom magic happens. So, Jason, I'm really glad you're here today. I want to talk to you. I want to talk to you about everything that you're about. I want to get your thoughts on everything. I really want to know more about alchemy and everything that you're about. Mycology, alchemy, all of these things, spagyrics, all of these things together. But the first thing we're going to talk about is Jason. You see, Jason feels like, actually he doesn't feel like, he knows that he's a modern day alchemist. Now, for people that are thinking, wait, I thought alchemy was this kind of ancient practice that fell off somehow or somehow lost to history. No. The alchemical teachings, the process has never stopped. What I've always learned is that the alchemists were the original scientists. So we have the scientists, the psychologists of today, but in, not even really ancient times, but not, 500 years ago, these humans were doing these same experiments with their materials and the environment around them. They were calling themselves alchemists. Well, Jason is here, and he's a modern alchemist, which I find so fascinating because he's continuing a tradition. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that, Jason. Tell me, what is alchemy to you?
Yeah, well, first off, I humbly refer to myself as an amateur alchemist.
Fair enough.
Or at the most, a practitioner of the spagyric arts, which we'll get into a little bit about what spagyrics are in a little bit here.
Sure.
But yeah, just kind of diving right into where you started, alchemy really is the foundation for a lot of our modern sciences. All of the modern disciplines of science that we know and recognize today really evolved out of the practice of traditional alchemy. And when I refer to traditional alchemy, I'm speaking of the Hermetic sciences that we can trace back to ancient Egypt, but probably go further back than that, kind of in line with the mysterious nature of the things that you talk about here on your podcast.
So you're thinking even pre-Diluvian Atlantean cultures, you're talking Hermes Trismegistus as this emissary of this knowledge. Would you say it's coming from that ilk? The Hermes Trismegistus ilk, like those
exactly
ancient cultures that are just lost to prehistory.
Well, precisely. And in the West, with the Western tradition of alchemy tracing back to Egypt, that information was transmitted to the people of that time through, as you mentioned, Hermes Trismegistus and other gods. Very similarly to the stories that we get coming out of the East with systems like Ayurveda that parallel alchemy really closely. where you can trace them back as far as you can, but the initial kind of story is that those wisdom and that knowledge came from the gods passing them down to the people in Ayurveda through Mount Kailash. But yeah, so there's a really mysterious kind of underpinning to really the beginnings of where that alchemical knowledge first developed.
But really, it was just seekers, like us and like our listeners. There's people that were hungry for knowledge. They saw their environment around them and they knew there was more to it. And they found by experimenting with not even these substances, just their environment around them, that they were able to create these healing medications, spiritual healing. And of course, alchemy is not just about the material development. It's also about spiritual development as well.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, it's like a manipulation of materials is really where the alchemical tradition started, is focused in transmutation, is how do we kind of break down philosophically and practically the building blocks of nature and able to work with them to understand nature more wholly. So really, when I talk about alchemy and when I get into the philosophy and the practice, what you're looking at is those first people were seekers, as you mentioned, and they were really just learning from the natural patterns of nature, right? They were learning from, okay, well, if you watch the water, evaporate and then condense into the air and then come back down and you have a more purified, rectified water that you're getting, and then how do we replicate that in a smaller scale in the form of like a still, so really the initial people who were practicing were observing nature and watching the natural patterns and learning about kind of the building blocks, the elements, quite literally the elements of fire, earth, air, and water, and learning how they kind of worked and melded together in order to kind of solidify or condense into the life that we experience.
So do you think that then these original alchemists started with the material understanding first and then applied that to their spiritual development? Or do you think it was twofold, where they saw the patterns in nature and then instantly knew to apply them to their spiritual self?
Well, I think, a lot of times, especially these days, those two practices, the physical practice and the spiritual practice, kind of get separated, where I don't think that traditionally that was the case. And I don't think, modernly, I don't think that's really the case either. Is like, you can't really separate that spiritual side from the physical side. It's kind of an illusion to be able to do that. And when you're working through the alchemical practices and working through the alchemical processes, the things that you're doing to the materials are on a metaphysical and spiritual level kind of reflexively being done to you as well. So it's kind of like this co-evolutionary process where you're helping to evolve the material that you're working with by basically using the natural processes inherent in the natural world, and then just applying them to the material to kind of aid in the evolution. So Aristotle has a line of thought where he talks about the accidental and the substantial form. So that's kind of a primary building block of the alchemical practice, whereas everything has kind of its seed of like how it's supposed to be. I kind of use the analogy of like, imagine in the acorn that seed and that blueprint for the oak that can grow out of it, and in that acorn there's the potential for a perfect oak tree that's completely balanced. But then you get the accidental form, which kind of comes through the environmental influences, so to speak. So it's like if you're in a really windblown area, then it might be kind of swept to one side, or if you're in a really nutrient depraved area, then that tree might kind of grow like fangled and not really quite as healthy and strong as that blueprint. So kind of through the tradition and the practice of alchemy, what we're really trying to get at in the most gross sense is that we're trying to take something that has expressed itself through its accidental form by developing through the natural world and kind of bring it back and elevate it back closer to its more substantial form.
Dude, that was like the most beautiful explanation. Holy cow. Like, I totally grasp alchemy now in a way that I guess I did have that understanding, but you just really kind of fleshed it out in a deeper way. So you're helping these materials achieve their perfect form through the alchemical process, and their growth and development has been influenced by their environment, but the potential is there for them to be in their perfect form. So you look at the human and the human being and the spirit, and you see that the spirit was a seed, or a human was a seed, a child, and through environment, they were windblown, right?
Exactly.
But there's the potential in there for them to have their most perfect form, and it takes discipline and development.
Right. So that kind of interplay between the material and the person, and through that philosophy is like you're working on the material, but you're not doing anything unnatural to the material. You're not kind of forcing the material into a way that it wouldn't theoretically already be going, as you're just helping to catalyze the process to its more substantial form, if that makes sense. And then bringing it back into the human side of it too, it's like you mentioned, the windblown is like we experience traumas and we experience things through our lives that kind of direct us, and maybe the struggles that we experience that kind of like define us to certain degrees. But then, most people are working to transcend those struggles and to become a better person because of it. So it's not to say that those things aren't important, but it's part of the evolutionary process. But if we can consciously focus on and practice through the struggles or the hands that we're dealt, then we can kind of influence our own evolutionary process.
So almost you could say that the situations that you go through in your life, the terrible things, the good things, they are the chart, the course of your alchemical evolution, whether you realize it or not. You could be completely ignorant to alchemy and all the things related to it, but yet if you're focused on personal development, in a way, you're going through the alchemical process.
For sure. And I think, that's kind of where modernly we kind of misunderstand alchemy, because I think a lot of people, when they think of the term alchemy, it's really this kind of obfuscated term that
you kind of visualize guys in the 1700s with big beakers and like long curly hair, and they're wearing these like period clothes, like 1700s clothes, and they're just like and you're like some kind of like a Rembrandt or like an old painting from back in the day, and they're just like, the alchemist,
right, yeah, or somebody who's just trying futilely to transmute lead into gold.
Yes,
right,
and just very focused.
It kind of gets often it kind of gets relegated to that area, and the more practical kind of everyday application of how we can work on the materials, or how the laboratory alchemy kind of reflexively affects us, kind of gets overlooked. The Jungian perspective of alchemy and kind of like the New Age perspective of alchemy coming into the late 19th century really kind of took it out of the practical realm and put it more into like a psychological realm.
So what would you say what is the Carl Jungian perception of alchemy from your perspective?
Well, I've done a lot more studying of the traditional alchemical works,
Sure.
kind of Paracelsus, a lot of the works of Paracelsus and Flamel, and the fellow named Jabir, who's an Arabian alchemist, and people who are really looking at both sides. So I feel like Jung's work has a lot of potency and validity, especially when it comes to understanding the psyche and the development of psyche.
But how does he relate to alchemy, I guess?
So I would say that he kind of took it out of the realm of saying like, oh, well, all of these laboratory practices are just metaphors for what we're experiencing on more of like a psycho-spiritual type of level, and kind of dismisses them altogether.
I see. He took the psycho-spiritual and put it in the laboratory to give it validity through the laboratory filter, in a sense.
Yeah, in a sense, or to say that, the laboratory practices weren't really practical, and what they were doing is alluding to this psycho-spiritual process, which in reality I think it's both, right? I think it's the psycho-spiritual process as well as the laboratory practice.
Sure. But I mean, alchemy though, do you feel like it's practiced by a lot of people, or are there a lot of people like yourself that consider themselves, you said, did you say amateur or what was your title that you gave yourself? I'm sorry.
Well, no, it's all good. Well, I call myself an amateur alchemist.
There
I
it
feel,
is.
I feel
Amateur
like,
alchemist.
You know, I feel like pretty hesitant to use heavy titles like and go around saying I'm an alchemist.
It's fun. Why
but
not?
People do that. It's not really my.
Sure.
MO.
But would you say there's a thriving alchemist community?
I would say more so than there has been. You know, so I think the history of alchemy is really interesting and kind of dips and weaves throughout people's awareness. And as I mentioned, most people's relation to it is just like, oh, well, there's like a handful of people in the 16th, 17th century that were trying to turn lead into gold, and most of those people were just charlatans that were trying to make money. And I think there's a lot more people these days who are being drawn towards the alchemical process, especially in regards to processing herbs and getting into some of the deeper like mineral and metal works, and its potency and its potential towards medicine. And I think there's a handful of people that are kind of driving that that awareness and that kind of interest back up. You know, my teacher, Robert Bartlett, I really love the way he teaches his class, but Robert Bartlett's up in Marysville, Washington, and he is a fantastic human being, just really humble and really knowledgeable and really dedicated to his art and his craft. And he started at the Paracelsus Research Society in Salt Lake City, Utah in the 70s, I believe, on his alchemical journey, and that lineage you can trace all the way back to kind of like the foundations of the alchemical practice. But he carries this wisdom and this knowledge in such a humble way, and he is kind of like, in my mind, the epitome of a great person to learn from. Both the
epitome of modern alchemy, you would say, in a way.
You know, I would say so.
Okay.
I don't think he would necessarily consider himself that, but again, I think he just has a kind of a humble way about himself, where he carries that wisdom in such a humble way that it's really easy for him to transmit it. And I would think that most people who kind of stumble across the path of alchemy, like I did, are really benefited by being able to study and work with him, and the kind of like tradition and the way that he sees things. But there's a whole, you know, it's not a myopic, like that's the only way that you can learn about alchemy is by studying with him. There's a lot of different ways, and there's ways of going back and reading through and translating some of the old obscured texts and learning how those things are kind of practically applied. And so, yeah, I think there's a whole movement, you know, and it's really interesting to me, especially where my main two interests are in the alchemical tradition and then the mycological tradition, or mycological studies, the sciences of mycology and mushrooms, where I think both of those fields are kind of having this moment in time, you know, where maybe they're not the most forward and most popular, but there's definitely kind of a renaissance, so to speak, about them, kind of an awareness of the practices coming back into play.
So do you think that is because people are just generally seeking more spiritual information? They're seeking to develop themselves, and they're setting up this attractive force, and wherever they're at in their life, they're then attracting that alchemical energy into their lives. And then they're meeting people like the people that you met, your great teacher, and then also other teachers that are out there, and maybe teachers that have long left the earth for a while.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I definitely think that's part of it. I know for my own journey, that was definitely a part of it. Is like, I never really sought out alchemy. It kind of stumbled across me, or I stumbled across it, and was really fascinated, because to me, I was really kind of getting into the roots of ethnobotany, kind of like cultural relationships to herbs, and plants, and specifically like herbalism and natural medicine, and how we relate to plants culturally in those ways. And I was getting really into like processing medicines, right? How do you make like tinctures, and how do you make other herbal types of extracts? And to me, it was like, it was missing something when I first started learning about it. So it was like there's like this whole world of Western herbalism and modern herbalism, and a lot of it is really kind of allopathic. And for those who maybe don't know that term, it's like it's really a myopic perspective of saying like, oh well, this herb is good for that, so we just use it unequivocally for that thing. And it's a really as my good friend Bren would say too, it's like it's a really limited way of looking at herbs and natural medicines. And I felt that way as a whole when I just kind of began my journey on into the herbal worlds and the herbal realms. And when I stumbled across alchemy, there was like a whole framework of how everything is perceived as living and how you look at these natural beings and how the different pieces kind of come together from the their morphology and the cosmology of the story of matter and how it came to be. And within that context, it just opened up my herbal practice, and especially my processing practice of like how do we make more effective medicines. It really just kind of opened that door, and I really loved it because it had both the physical side, which I was really interested in the way of like making tinctures and applying herbal medicines to people, and then also the more esoteric and psychospiritual and metaphysical side, where you're also having a reason and a cosmology, like a story for why you're putting these things together the way that you're putting them together, or taking them apart the way that you're taking them apart.
So from what I understand, and it's okay if you don't remember, because I don't remember because somebody told me, but there's 7 stages of alchemy. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's
in the
a
general
couple
alchemical sense, or is that just one school of thought?
Well, yeah, I mean, for the practical laboratory work, there's 7 stages, and then there's 12 cycles as well. Honestly, I'm pretty bad with recalling them right off the top of my head.
That's okay, me too.
But like distillation, sublimation, putrefaction, calcination.
That's way more than
yeah. So those are a handful, and
okay.
those things, again, they kind of have a dual meaning. So whereas like Jung might talk about those things and just relegate them purely to a psychospiritual process, what a practicing alchemist might do is take those things, see how they're applied in the laboratory to the material that you're working with, like plants or mushrooms, and then also see the psychospiritual process.
So I guess we can segue a little bit and talk about Spagyrics, because I know you're very much involved in Spagyrics, and your company, Feral Fungi, you produce spagyric products. So tell me first, before we delve into Spagyrics, what is Spagyrics? Like, how would you explain that to somebody in a very basic sense?
Yeah, so the whole framework of Spagyrics is a pretty big, and kind of, I feel like with any sort of philosophical thought, is like you can go down rabbit holes that last forever, and you can kind of talk about multiple different aspects of it. But I always kind of start on the most basic sense. So the term spagyric was coined by a Swiss alchemist or Swiss chemist fellow named Paracelsus. That's probably what most people recognize.
His name keeps coming up. Who is this Paracelsus guy?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt your flow of thought, but I just keep hearing Paracelsus. I want to know who Paracelsus is.
Yeah. It's all good. His given name was Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim.
Dude, my neighbor had that name.
Yeah. Super common name. But his father was a theologian of the time in the 1500s, so the 16th century, and he, to put it shortly, he was a Swedish chemist, Swiss chemist, and was basically like the vagabond chemist. Like he was like he's known as the modern of iatrochemistry, so like modern pharmaceuticals. And he really did a deep dive into the alchemical tradition and how to really create, as he would put it, medicines for metals and men. So he was really kind of taking this alchemical tradition and putting it back into a practical application, whereas at this time in history, it had kind of slipped away and had really become that kind of thing that we were talking about earlier, where there was a lot of charlatans and a lot of people who were just kind of like, oh, well, the ultimate goal is to make lead into gold, and then I can be rich and famous and well known. So
meanwhile, nobody told those guys about inflation back then.
Yeah, right. And then he really took that and brought it back into being about medicine, right? So he was really like, well, the real goal of this alchemical practice is that we can produce these medicines, and maybe transmutation is a byproduct of that, or is like a result of that, but really what we're looking at is we're making effective medicines. And so he would travel around in the 16th century to the schools and the medical establishments of that time and challenge the doctors and the medical establishments and burn the textbooks, and really he was very bombastic, which is a term that we actually get from his name, Theophrastus Bombastus.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
Hey, say the name again. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim is his full name. But he was a very bombastic character, right? So he would kind of go on these soapboxes and just like preach about the fallacies of modern medicine, and was really
so this is Paracelsus. This is like my kind of guy. I'm actually loving Paracelsus right now.
Yeah.
So he was not only a firebrand and just a rabble rouser, he was also highly intelligent and was able to almost revive and bring to the forefront of that time alchemy.
Yeah, definitely. He in a lot of ways he did, and is really well known for his works around it. And he learned a lot of his relations to natural and herbal medicines through the folk herbalists of that time. Like he would travel and he would learn through like the village witches and the people who were just practicing for their community.
Which may have maintained a tradition over thousands of years.
Absolutely.
And he was tapping into that.
Exactly. So he kind of married that traditional knowledge from the folk side with the traditional wisdom from the alchemical tradition, going back through Spain and then into Arabia and then back into Egypt, and really kind of wove it together. He was a big proponent of developing his own words, which is where that term spagyric comes from, kind of bringing it back full circle.
Sure. So he's the guy that coined the term, as you said. He coined the term spagyrics.
Right. So that term comes from the Greek spao, S-P-A-O, means to separate, and agiro, which means to recombine. I've also heard more accurate translations of agiro being to like re-aliven or reawaken. So basically, on the most foundational level, what a spagyric is you're taking the material apart into kind of its foundational pieces or principles from the alchemical model, purifying them, and then putting them back together to produce a more evolved substance, a more evolved medicine.
So there is a spagyric process, I imagine, and it's probably very lengthy and complicated, but you're taking a compound and you're burning it, you're doing 7 different things, right? And this is the spagyric stuff, or is this... No, this is a spagyric. Okay, so you're doing 7 different stages of just mirroring the alchemical process. You're doing 7 different stages of a form, some kind of distillation, or what would you call it?
Yeah, so I mean, you can start with the kind of like the best starting places with spagyric tinctures, which is what we produce with Feral Fungi. But with the spagyric tinctures, basically you're doing an extract on the material, and then you're taking the material after you've extracted it. Most people at this point will just throw it away at this point or compost it.
Like a traditional herbalist. Like they made their tincture, their compost, the herbs go in the compost.
Right, because all the medicine and everything you're after is in that tincture. So we take that that material that has been extracted and we burn it down into a really fine ash, and then we leach the pure mineral salts from those ashes. Basically means that we soak those ashes in distilled water, filter them, recrystallize them, and then put them back into the final tincture. So now on the most basic level, you're reconstituting the soul and the spirit, or the sulfur and the mercury in the alchemical terms, with the salt of the mushroom or the body of the mushroom or the herb or whatever you're working with. And so those mineral salts, those crystalline mineral salts that we're putting back into the tincture, I kind of describe them in two ways, right? Because like from the philosophical level, it's the body of the material that you're working with. So it's like the vehicle through which the soul and the spirit kind of move. And then on a more practical, physiological, scientific level for the folks that are into that kind of thing, it's a complex of trace minerals. And there's a lot of research saying that that those trace minerals are helping with cell absorption of some of the other compounds available from the plants, from the mushrooms, etc. So that's kind of like the most basic way.
So after this process, you said you get a mineral salt. So after the 7 stages mirroring the alchemy and the spagyric process, you at the end of it all, you get this crystalline salt. Is that correct?
Well, the crystalline salt is a part of the process, right?
Okay.
So when you're doing the full spagyric extract, which I can define here and talk about in a second, you're getting multiple different parts and pieces. So from the alchemical tradition and from the cosmology of alchemy, right, everything evolves from one thing. It's kind of like the initial source, kind of like the center of spirit. It's like
Of
the
all. The all.
Yes, exactly. And the alchemists refer to that as like the prima materia, as like the first matter. And then that material is divided into 2. So then we have our first instance of duality, right? We've got the light and the dark, masculine, feminine. We've got the duality that we experience through many different philosophies and frames of thought throughout history. And then from those emanate the 4 elements. So we have the earth, the water, the air, and the fire. And then from those elements, then we get the 3 principles. So the train of thought and the philosophy from the alchemical perspective is that everything that we can tangibly put our hands on and see in this material world is composed of those 3 principles. And in the alchemical tradition, they call those principles the salt, which are those mineral salts like I was talking about earlier. And I'm just going to put all these in like a context of plants because they're a little bit easier to understand with other things that are chemically a little bit different. But you have the salts, which are the mineral salts, the body of the material. You have the sulfur, which is the essence of the material. In plants, it's like the essential oil. And then you have the mercury. So I think of like the mercury is like the spirit. It's like the universal property. So I think of like the essence, the sulfur, as being like if you smell an essential oil. So go to the store, pick up a bottle of lavender essential oil, and you smell that lavender. It's like what plant that came from, right? Because that's like the individual nature of the plant that you're working with or that you're extracting. And then the mercury, the spirit, is more of like the universal level of that material. So any plant material that you ferment and then distill, so you go through the stages, the putrefaction, the distillation, you're going to get the pure mercury or spirit or alcohol off of the plant material. It's like ethanol. And that's also where we get the term spirits from as well, right?
I've always wondered that. I was actually just thinking about that recently.
Right. So it's like the spirit from the plant realm is ethanol.
And that's what you would consider the sulfur.
No, that would be the mercury.
Oh, the mercury.
Yeah,
okay.
And then the sulfur would be like the essential oil.
Okay. Got it.
So in the tincture process, just to kind of like break it down a little bit more,
sure.
The way that it works is that you have your mercury, which a lot of people use like a grain alcohol or like a cane alcohol, and that's universal. So you can extract the oil or the sulfur from pretty much any other plant or material with that universal spirit, right? And so we're extracting the sulfur with the spirit, with the mercury, and then that mercury is kind of attuning to whatever material you're working with. So then you've got those 2 principles, right? Your sulfur and your mercury. And then you can take the material that you've extracted from with the spirit, burn it down into those pure mineral salts, crystallize those mineral salts and put them back. And now you've got a full spagyric tincture.
So you have the sulfur, the mercury, and then
the salt.
The salt.
Yeah.
And the salt would represent what again?
The body.
The body. Right. Wow. This is, look, spagyrics. This is mind blowing because it feels to me like spagyrics is the most potent form of these natural medicines because you're really going all in. Like you're getting every type of magical medicinal property out of it and then also reconstituting it.
Yeah,
in its perfect form. Would you say that?
Yeah, and totally. And so as I mentioned earlier, it's like the tinctures is like a very simplified form of that. And a lot of people make tinctures, but even by just reincorporating the pure mineral salts, through the people that I've seen do it and provide spagyrics and spagyric tinctures to people, you know, they're a lot more effective in certain cases than just regular tinctures.
Because it has that extra energetic push. It's just like that healing energy, the spirit of the plant, the body of the plant, it's all there.
For sure. Well, I would definitely say that. And I think you can also justify it from a purely like mechanical level with the mineral salts being a complex of trace minerals, helping with cell absorption of the other compounds in the plant.
Delivery. It's almost like the salt would be like a delivery method.
Yeah, right. So we think about like the body of the material. So it's like one way that I like to think about is like if you have just a regular tincture, you've got a disembodied soul and spirit that are just kind of floating around. So it's harder for them to go where they need to go. In the body, you're still getting, you know, physiological compounds, so you're still going to get a benefit from those. But when you add that salt back in, it's like the vehicle to kind of take it into the body where it needs to go. So you think of like, we have a physical body. So when you put that body back into that tincture, then it knows kind of has a, I would say from a philosophical level and a metaphysical level is like there's an intelligence that you're kind of reawakening in that material by giving it that vehicle to the body
just like our own body. Like you know, exactly. you're trying to work on something, you want to build a house. Well, you can think about it, you're an ethereal thought, you can be this spirit, but it's a lot in the third dimension. It's really hard to build a house without a physical body.
Exactly.
Right? You can try, but then so in that same sense, like having the salts there, the body to act as a vehicle for that energy, the spirit of the plant to get to you. Is that what the crux of it is?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and when you're making tinctures, you know, you can kind of play with the ratios, but when you're doing a full spagyric extract, so just to give you like a super, super basic rundown on what that looks like, you're distilling the essential oils from the plant material or attaining the oil, which will be the sulfur. Then you're taking that plant material, fermenting it, and then distilling it to yield the ethanol, and then you're taking everything that's left over, everything that's not in that essential oil or that ethanol, and you're burning it into a really fine ash, leaching those mineral salts, getting the pure salt, and then you're putting those things back together. So the ratios can be a little bit different when you're working with like a tincture because it's based on how much alcohol you're putting in the material, right? But when you're doing a full spagyric extract, you're getting all three parts in the natural quantity that they are in the material. So that's on a more philosophical level. So when you think about that practically is like when you work with something like lavender, right, you're going to get a lot of essential oils and you're going to get like probably a pretty good amount of alcohol, but you may not get as much like mineral salts. And then when you're working with something like lemon balm, even though it's like really fragrant, it doesn't have a lot of essential oils. So you're not going to get very much essential oil, but you might get a lot of alcohol, and then so everything is kind of coming in the constituent parts, and then you can learn more about the material that you're working with and kind of like how it comes together elementally too.
So you have a company, Feral Fungi, and you sell spagyric products.
Yeah, so we focus on spagyric tinctures. So as I kind of broke down, the full spagyric extracts is a bit more of a complicated process, and it's outlined really well with plants and with certain minerals and with animal materials and with metals. But when you really get into the mushrooms, which is a really kind of the area that I've been most drawn to,
so you do spagyric mushrooms, like
spagyric mushrooms.
Okay,
tinctures,
so you're doing that, what you just described beautifully, I might add. What you just described, the spagyric process, you're doing that to mushrooms, because you could do that to herbs. You could do that to anything.
Yeah.
But right now you're doing that with Feral Fungi. You're doing this with mushrooms.
Right. And what interested me most about that was that there wasn't really a historical context. I mean, alchemy in general, the historical context is pretty, as I mentioned before, kind of obfuscated by the sands of time, so to speak. But mushrooms at best just kind of got tapped on to the end of the herbal world, which, as we know now, mushrooms are phylogenetically, or on the tree of life, much more closely related to animals. So it kind of opened this whole thought and process in my mind of like, well, if you're wanting to work with the mushrooms alchemically, you can't really apply the same processes that you would with plants. And through my experiments, I've really found that to be true. So on a commercial level, we're producing spagyric tinctures. So we're basically doing a dual extraction on the mushrooms with organic cane alcohol and then water, and then getting all the goodness out of the mushrooms, putting those pieces back together, extracting the mineral salts, and putting that back into the final tincture. So in that regard, our extracts you're not going to find anything like them available on the market. Mushroom.
Wow. So that's actually a huge statement. I mean, you're creating something that's exclusive in the world. There's no one else doing what you're doing.
I mean, there's probably other people doing it now. You know, I've thought about it for quite a while, and there's other people who've kind of had that thought to explore that path on their own as well, I'm sure. But when I started delving into it and exploring it, I coined a term, mycology.
That's a wonderful term.
The intersection of alchemy.
What are you,
and mycology.
Paracelsus, or just making up words here?
Just making up words. But that's what I wrote in Peter McCoy's book, Radical Mycology. I wrote my article entitled Mycology, and I kind of work on more the philosophical, esoteric, and like the writing side of that from under that title, Mycology. So I have a website called Mycology too. That's hopefully going to be updated here shortly, but where I put more of like the writing out, going into like the doctrine of signatures and all these kinds of things that we work with. But so I've personally experimented a lot with different ways to process the mushrooms. And so I've personally done full spagyric extracts on mushrooms, but just commercially it's not really viable, as well as a lot of it at this point, to my mind, is pretty experimental. And so some of the compounds that I may be retrieving through my processes, I'm not 100% sure until we can get them tested and things like that, if they're
even ready for the market.
Yeah, or if they're 100% safe, right? It's like,
Oh, wow.
or what the implications might be, because not everything that you process, even if it's according to the spagyric method, might be suitable for human consumption. I mean, intuitively, I'd say that they probably are, but I feel like there needs to be more research before I would feel comfortable releasing a full spagyric extract of a mushroom.
So tell me, or describe, what are the feelings or sensations, or just what happens to you when you take spagyric mushroom extract? Obviously, it's not a psychedelic drug. This is more like just about health, rejuvenation, and obviously even more. So what is that like?
Right. So, medicinal mushrooms have their own long-standing tradition, thousands of years of use in places like Asia, even though there's kind of a fungal phobia in the West, or like a fear of mushrooms.
Do you think that has something to do with the psychedelic mushroom movement? Like they just assume that if it's not like a criminy mushroom or a portobello, it's going to get you high. Is that kind of the deal?
Well, it either going to get you high or it's going to kill you, right? So I think there's a fear. I think the fear is probably more around the potential of death than psychoactive effects, and maybe there's like some esoteric control aspect around the psychoactive medicines, like there are around other psychoactive medicines. But
it's possible.
But yeah, I think the fungal phobia is more related to the role that mushrooms play in the environment, right? Because mushrooms are, I call them like nature's little alchemists, because they are like the transmuting force in the natural world. So they're like breaking down dead and decaying material into its kind of compound parts, its like components, so that they can be distributed to or exchanged for sugars with plants and things like that. So
right, because people, just to touch on that a little bit, the mycelial networks of various mushrooms, they do store nutrients, it's been found. In studies, they store nutrients, and they can distribute those nutrients to other plants within their, mycelial network, tree roots or whatever. They can send nutrients to those trees. Is that correct?
Yep, exactly.
That's mind-blowing to me.
So mushrooms are kind of like their whole own esoteric world by themselves, but they have a lot of medicinal applications, right? And they've been used traditionally in Chinese medicine specifically for, as far as we can tell, like 3,000 to 4,000 years, probably even longer. Kind of the same thing with alchemy. But there's instances where we've found there's a really famous one of Otzi the Iceman, who is found in the Swiss Alps. And they dated his body or his remains back to, I think it was like 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. And this man who was traversing the Swiss Alps was found with these tattoos all over his body and a pouch. And in that pouch, among other herbs, he had a tender conch mushroom, which is the Fomes fomentarius, and then he had a birch polypore mushroom. And those mushrooms have shown to have various medicinal benefits. The tender conch mushroom also gets its name from being able to carry a live tinder, so he could have been using it for that. But then the birch polypore also is extensively used for its antibacterial, antiviral properties. And then they found that those tattoos all over his body, turns out that they weren't just random points and tattoos, but they actually lined up with meridian systems and Eastern systems of medicine.
That is absolutely fascinating. So he had these tattoos, this 8,000-year-old Iceman they find in the Swiss Alps. He has these tattoos that correspond with the meridians of Eastern medicine. And then on top of that, he's got essentially, I guess, a bottle of Advil with him, or maybe some, the equivalent of like some
maybe
antibiotics.
Like Percocet or something. Yeah.
Just in case, you gotta, and it's just mind blowing. So it's been obviously it's been with us since day one, human development. Do we have, I know we have cannabinoid receptors. I know we have opiate receptors in the brain. Do we have natural parts of our body that work kind of in synthesis with mushrooms?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, again, there's kind of multiple frameworks in which you can look at that. And one of them is that, the mushrooms are developed. They were one of the first multicellular organisms to develop on the terrestrial Earth, right? And so they faced a lot of the same biological threats that we do. So a lot of the same viruses and bacteria. And so naturally they developed extracellular compounds, or like what we refer to as like metabolites, that they use to kind of defend themselves against these biological threats, right? And
isn't it true that there's no other type of life like mushrooms on Earth? And there's a theory that the mushroom spores may have come from asteroids in deep space, and then the spores may have been implanted on this Earth. Have you heard that?
I've definitely heard that. Yeah, I have not done enough research myself into that to know one way or another, but it's definitely intriguing. I know for sure that the spores can survive the vacuum of space. So it's definitely
cow.
I mean, it's definitely fascinating. And
it's mind-blowing.
They really are kind of the foundation for why we're even able to live on this Earth too, right? Because it's like before plants lived terrestrially on the Earth, right? They were living in this like nutrient rich broth of the sea, and then it was really kind of a relationship between the mushrooms and the algae that gave us the lichens, and those lichens started to break down the rocks and make it into kind of bioavailable soil, so that those plants could slowly move out of that like nutrient dense broth.
So it's very important. Mushrooms were a huge part in not just human development, but just actually the development of all life on Earth.
Terrestrial life, I would
I
would make that argument for sure. Yeah.
And then here we are in Oregon. I know we're just kind of we're talking about a lot of different things, but
Sure.
we love talking about mushrooms. In Oregon, I've heard, is the largest mycelial network in the world.
Yes.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, out in Eastern Oregon.
Eastern Oregon.
Yeah, it's the Armillaria malaya, I think is the Latin name. It's the honey mushroom.
And it has more mycelial kind of, I guess, more mycelial fibers than the neural network of the human brain. Is that a rumor or is that true?
I mean, I could not say objectively whether or not it does, but I would assume so.
I've heard that before from people that are far more informed than me.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that being true for sure. But what we do know is that to this date, it's the largest living organism that we found. And most
So wait, largest living organism on Earth.
Right. That we found.
Largest living organism on Earth. That is freaking fascinating. And it's a mycelial network in Oregon, not far from here. And it could be emulating some sort of brain, some sort of neural network.
I mean, yeah, I think it depends on which communities you're talking to. I feel like a materialistic scientific community might be hesitant to say that something like a mycelial network could have intelligence, but I would venture to say that it's definitely possible, and I feel like it would also be short-sighted of us to think that nature doesn't have its own forms of intelligence, even if we don't recognize them the same as ours. But yeah, so it's pretty wild.
In your own personal opinion, now, do you feel like, it's just you, Jason Scott, Midnight on Earth, do you feel like mushrooms, obviously they have some sort of purpose and some sort of mission, but do you think they may have come here from space? This is all speculation. Come here from outer space or some outer Earth scenario to help humanity evolve. Like somebody was like, look, these guys need a little boost. Like it's like putting like like protein in your shake or something, like boost it up. Like we're going to help these guys develop. We're going to send some of these spores, and then they're going to find the spores. It's going to help their consciousness develop. What do you think about that theory?
Well, I'm not so ethnocentric that I think that they would do that just for us. I think that, maybe the mushrooms have their own prerogative and their own kind of pathway. But I would venture to say that through the way that the mushrooms interact with their natural environment, and through the way that they've developed evolutionarily, and through the way that they behave within ecosystems, and through the way that they provide medicine, that they definitely have a lot of different ways that they could provide insight for how we could move forward in a more intelligent way, right? Because the mushrooms basically have re-inherited the earth after every kind of major extinction period because of the adaptive nature that they have. And then generally, most mushrooms aren't outgrowing the resources available within their environment, right? So even in the case of like the armillaria mushroom in Eastern Oregon, some people consider that to be a parasitic mushroom, but there's also another perspective of looking at that where it brings succession of kind of like the next levels and the next phases. So it's maybe killing some trees, but whether or not that is objectively a bad thing, I think is hard for us to tell as human beings, because I think there's an innate intelligence in nature where, maybe they are kind of selectively helping to thin the forest so that other more diverse forms of life and ecology can develop and grow kind of in the spaces in between.
So somehow they're able to distinguish these different, through their mushroom intelligence, they're able to distinguish these different types of trees and understand which ones are going to be healthy potentially. I mean, this is all speculation, but it has some role in developing it. And you think that that's way more beneficial than the people that would say they're parasitic, because it sounds like they're killing some trees. The big mushroom brain in Oregon is killing some trees.
Right.
And so some people feel like it's parasitic because of that.
Well, I mean, they classify it as a parasite, but but I think, again, I think nature has a lot more intelligence than we often give it credit for. And even in the case of like, plants that we consider to be parasitic are not always, usually not completely detrimental to the environment that they're living in. And they're usually kind of filling some sort of niche, a lot of times left by kind of some destruction or chaos that we've caused somewhere along the way.
So tell me, what are some of the health benefits, or what are some of the benefits that people are, they're going to your website, I believe, what's your website? feralfungi.com?
Feralfungi.com. Yep.
Feral fungi. Sorry.
There's infinite ways to say it. Fungi is the proper way to say it. You could say fungi, you could say fungi.
Feral, Feral, fungi, F-U-N, fun. I'm all about fun. Fungi, feralfungi.com. So somebody goes to your website, they get like literally this unbelievable product that's so rare. What are some of the benefits they're going to experience? How is it going to help them?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways that mushrooms help. As I mentioned before, they kind of developed in response to a lot of the same biological threats that we do in terms of microorganisms and things like that. But one of the primary ways is that all mushrooms are going to help with. And so if you ever look at a list of the benefits that mushrooms have, you're going to find a really long list. And one of the reasons for this is that all of the mushrooms have complexes of polysaccharides, which just means long-chain sugars that are bound in the cell wall of the mushroom. And these long-chain sugars, known as beta-glucan polysaccharides, have their own host of benefits that they offer to the individual who's taking them. So there's been a lot of research talking about the benefits of polysaccharides and helping to support the innate immune system, helping to support the body's inflammation response, helping to regulate healthy blood sugar levels, acting as a prebiotic. So, most people are familiar with probiotics, right? So you want to give your body those natural, healthy microbiota, or the microorganisms for healthy digestion. But prebiotics is even a step before that. It's giving your body the correct sugars to be able to feed those microorganisms that we need for our processes, and helps to nourish the gut flora that way. So that's among
that's pretty huge, actually.
yeah, and among other things, that's kind of the way that mushrooms in general, all mushrooms are going to help with those things. And the polysaccharides would be considered primary metabolites because they're contained within the cell wall of the mushroom. So it's really important too. It's like you can't just go to the store, buy a mushroom, grind it up, and eat it, or take it. You're not really going to get anything out of it. So that's why you have to have an extract, or like a mushroom extracted product, is because you have to break down that cell wall before your body can access those polysaccharides.
So you have this product, the spagyric mushroom. Tell me about some of the other products that you have.
Yeah, well, we can go into the mushrooms a little bit more, because that's
Sure.
kind of like a broad overview of the mushrooms. Then each of the individual mushrooms have compounds that they refer to as secondary metabolites. Again, compounds that the mushroom has developed over time, and those secondary metabolites help us in various different ways too. So, like, one of the main kind of mushrooms that really has grabbed my attention and that I've been working with a lot is the lion's mane mushroom, that's been touted for its neurological benefits. And we've seen things happen with people's nervous systems and with neural health that before working with the lion's mane, I didn't even really think was possible. It's like a lot of people kind of come to this point where it's like they have some sort of neuropathy, whether it's like nerve pain or lack of neural sensation, and just kind of live with it. But the lion's mane, we've found, has been so effective with so many different types of neuropathy, and everything from helping to think clearer and to be more focused and have a stronger memory, to getting those kind of like clear.
So it's really just improving cognitive abilities, and just really cognition and memory and language, speech, all of that stuff.
Yep,
That's amazing.
cognitive abilities, but also like nerve pain. So we've had some folks who have like lack of neural sensation in their peripheries and like the wrist or like their legs, and through taking the lion's mane have been able to restore that neural sensation. People who have experienced lots of nerve pain, who have been able to kind of help at least tamper, if not stop, that nerve pain through the lion's mane mushroom.
Wow, that's huge. And this is this new, like lion's mane? Is this kind of a new trend in mycology right now?
I mean, I feel like people have known about it for quite a while, right? But there's definitely a trend about it going around, especially with the draw towards like nootropics and things that are going to kind of like what I've heard people refer to as like biohacking, where how do you kind of like tune your body to be the most premier functioning,
right, efficient, just everything's working like clockwork.
Exactly.
I feel like I already figured that out, and I feel like it's iodine. I feel like the secret is high doses of iodine, and we could talk about that at a different time, but that's what I feel like these days.
Definitely. Well, I mean, most people are definitely iodine rich, or iodine deficient. Rather, we don't really have great ways to access iodine in our diets. So
yeah, we'll talk
that
about it
definitely
after the
helps.
show. I'm going to get this guy on iodine. It's going to change his life. But I want to
Awesome.
talk about your perspective as someone that's deeply engrossed in just mycology and the spirit of the mushroom, the understanding. I've learned an incredible amount from you today, and I just want to know what your opinion is of psychedelic mushrooms, and then also your opinion on the current trend of microdosing.
Yeah. So that is another big topic.
Well, I mean, I feel like as someone that's really, you're really in sync. You're in a symbiotic relationship with all these different kinds of mushrooms. You know,
Sure.
reishi and all these different one, lion's mane that we just talked about. But psychedelic mushrooms, you know, you have your, and we could talk about the kinds. You have your cyanescence, your cubensis, right? And then there's the amanitas, are like super kind
which
of
are a
dangerous.
whole different set of compounds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you feel like they're being used correctly in modern society, or are they being abused?
Often not. I feel like they're more times than not being abused, just the way we see with a lot of those sacred plant medicines. I
feel the same way.
I would say the same. Beyond the mushrooms, the same occurs with ayahuasca and with peyote, and I feel like.
And DMT, I'm noticing as well.
Well, yeah, and DMT as a peripheral to ayahuasca for sure. Yeah, you know, I think again it's a pretty big question. I feel like, you know, those plants, those medicines, whether we're talking about the psilocybin mushrooms, whether we're talking about ayahuasca, whether we're talking about peyote, all of those things carry this deep intelligence, right? So I would consider those things to be what you might refer to as like master plants, right? Because those medicines, the way that they work, it's not like other plant medicines that we have access to. You know, it's like a lot of plant medicines, even the ones that interact with our consciousness in certain ways. You know, it's like those ones have this potential of healing many different things from a physiological level, but then also on, again, kind of delving into both sides, that psychospiritual level as well. And I think, you know, I try not to make any judgments on whether or not they're being used correctly or not, because I don't know if I'm the person to decide what's correct and what's not correct with it. But
of course.
But I do think, you know, it is really interesting because we're alongside the consciousness rising around mushrooms in general. We're definitely seeing a rise in consciousness around psilocybin, especially for its medicinal and therapeutic uses.
Well, yeah, because right now there's even a movement in Colorado and in Oregon here. I definitely signed the petition, and in California as well, to legalize medicinal psychedelic mushrooms and have almost like a dispensary like we have with cannabis, where you have a dispensary type scenario where you can go buy a mushroom chocolate or an eighth of mushrooms and have a, I guess, safe trip under certain circumstances.
Right.
How do you feel about that? Do you feel like that's the right move for psychedelic mushrooms, to be in almost like a dispensary type platform?
I mean, I feel like it's better than being criminalized.
Yeah, well, yes, of course.
so I would say the foundationally decriminalizing nature would be the first step. But I feel like with a lot of those sacred plants that I was mentioning earlier too, it's like they're kind of moving towards a trend of strictly therapeutic use, which I think setting and a proper guidance through a psychedelic experience like that is absolutely crucial, especially if you want to get into like the deep healing potential that they have to offer. However, do I think a clinical setting is necessarily the best way to do that? Not necessarily, right? So I think you know, it's a step forward because it's bringing awareness to those plants and those mushrooms and those compounds, and the benefits that they have. However, I feel like with a lot of natural medicine, it's like a really myopic perspective, right? Because people talk about psilocybin mushrooms and then they just say, oh, well, it's psilocybin and psilocybin is doing all these things. And now there's scientists who are trying to synthesize psilocybin out of E. coli, you know, growing E. coli that produce psilocybin. And it's like, to me, that kind of gets away from from the potential of it, because I think, again, there's like an
the spirit, the sacredness.
Exactly. So there's an inherent intelligence and spirit to those mushrooms and to those plants that when you take them out of their traditional context, when you take them out of their natural environment, you kind of lose something there. And so I kind of wonder, this might be speculation too, of like how far down that rabbit hole do we go before, instead of becoming more found, as I feel like those things could kind of offer us pathways to, how far away do we move from them where we're kind of getting more lost through their use, and when you're applying them wrong. Right? Yeah, exactly.
You disconnected from their true purpose.
Yeah. So I think, it's a pretty big and complex subject, and obviously, I try to remain non-judgmental about the different ways, and I think that there's definitely benefits through the way that the legislature is moving forward and the way that the research is becoming available and showing the potency and the efficacy of use of psilocybin mushrooms. I mean, it's amazing, especially, as myself, who's somebody who's struggled with depression in the past and kind of chosen an alternative route to dealing with it, to see that people can take a large dose of psilocybin mushrooms and have a long-term cure to their depressive states, right? And even just being able, instead of having to regularly take some sort of antipsychotic medicine, be able to take this natural mushroom that has little to no side effect, and to really be able to perceive the world in a way that is much more healthy,
more authentic.
Yeah, exactly. And in regards, to the conversation, why I mentioned as well that it's like a lot bigger topic than I really know how to kind of take a strong stance in too, is because I've also heard a lot of stories of like people who have taken psilocybin mushrooms with the intention to like get down and party, but then had these like crazy revelations about their lives and about the things that they were doing and about the crazy, way that they were treating themselves and their bodies, and kind of did a 180 because of that, right? So it's like sometimes I feel like there has been expression of those instances where even if the mushroom was taken, maybe not in a context that would be coming from a healthy state of mind, that there's enough intelligence in that fungal being to kind of help
guide them where they need to go, right?
Yeah. So that's so I think that's where it gets really tricky, right? Because then there's like that side of it where there's benefit, maybe even if it's not taken in the best setting, but then it's becoming a little overblown and a little and
there's benefit to it sneaking up behind you, and
yeah.
But the thing is, though, what I'm seeing is I'm noticing that the people are microdosing and they're taking these small amounts of mushrooms. And when I have taken psychedelic mushrooms in the past, and even for me, and I believe we talked about this in private in the past, when I have reishi mushrooms, when I have lion's mane, when I have any type of mushroom that's not just like your standard portobello crimini, I have some sort of psychedelic mushroom effect. And for me, to take a little bit of psychedelic mushrooms, whether it's just like a little gram of psilocybin or like, a gram of cyanescence, which is actually more potent than psilocybin, I have a really powerful trip. So what I have trouble understanding with people is like they're taking these little bit of mushrooms every day for depression, which is so amazing, and other mental health issues. But are they then potentially losing the sacredness of the mushroom and then also detaching from a functional reality?
Again, I think that's a really big question, and I don't think that there's necessarily a straightforward answer to it. I think from my own perspective, psilocybin mushrooms seem to be having a lot of kind of mechanically verified health benefits through the different compounds that they contain. So really nourishing for the nervous system as well, helping to rebuild neural connections, part of maybe why they're helpful in things like depression. And I think it just depends on the context and the way that they're being used, because I feel like, maybe that microdosing could be helpful for people, right? Because you can kind of get some of the more physiological benefits of the mushroom, at least as far as I've understood microdosing. I've never personally done it, but but it's like you get the kind of therapeutic benefits from the mushroom without going full on out of your mind.
But actually having a psychedelic trip. Like
right, exactly.
Experience. But then for me, it seems like even if you take the littlest bit, there's still that essence of the experience there. You are having a psychedelic trip, whether you realize it or not.
I mean, but aren't we always kind of having a psychedelic
I think
trip?
so too. I mean, we have so many hormones in our brain, and then we're just taking these substances, I've noticed, to kind of boost our release of these hormones. But if we do it naturally, it's a whole different experience. So yes,
right. Well, I mean, it's pretty. I mean, when you get to it on that level, again, it's kind of hard to differentiate because the psilocybin is a tryptamine molecule, right? And the tryptamine are the base molecules for like our serotonin and our dopamine. So basically all of our perceptive, all of the compounds that you can draw towards our perceptive states, and like the synapses, the neurons firing through the synapses are all tryptamine based molecules. So, I mean, you could even make the argument, I feel like, that tryptamine molecules, whether naturally derived or otherwise, just kind of show you more of a realistic picture of what's going on. So I mean, I think it kind of depends on the context in which you're asking the question, because it's like, will it make somebody more high functioning in a sick society? Probably not. You know, will it turn them on or turn them towards more of a healthy connection with nature? Maybe. But, you know, I don't think that there's like a one size fits all, because I feel like the way and the context in which I've heard of microdosing being used too, a lot of times is like, for me, kind of concerning, because it's like more driving towards like the towards ends of production and
just making it a product, essentially
making it a product and making more consumable products, right? So it's like, how can I take these mushrooms so that I can be more creative and create this next software that I can develop for this company and, you know, have this new startup, right? So it's like, there's a lot of people, I feel like, in the Bay Area that are kind of trending the whole psilocybin and LSD use for microdosing.
But their intentions might not be in the right place. Because they're like, oh, I want to make this the best video game for my development company. And they're like taking mushrooms to figure out how to make this video game that may or may not be benefiting society in any way, shape, or form.
Right. And I mean, I may have my own judgments on that, and who knows whether or not there is a direct answer of whether or not like that's,
sure.
You know, the mushrooms have their own prerogative or not. But I feel like that would be kind of, for me, it seems kind of in attrition to what direction the mushrooms might naturally take people in the proper context and the proper set and setting.
So as humanity develops towards the future, as we're growing now in this modern time, it's so wild, but here we are. What do you think the role, let's just start with alchemy. What do you think the role of alchemy is in the future of human development? Do you think it's going to catch on? Do you think we'll all eventually become alchemists in our own way?
Well, I mean, it depends on who you're talking to, because the chocolatier down the street might consider themselves an alchemist, but you know, I think that, you know, one of the reasons that I've been drawn to both alchemy and mycology is because I think that they offer us frameworks for how to perceive and how to live within a social context that is more closely resonating with the natural world, right? So it's like, I feel like they offer us pathways forward, so to speak. I think I'm having trouble kind of figuring out how to put this into words, because I think what a lot of it is stories and context and cosmology, right? Because like our I feel part of the reason that we're so lost as a culture, you know, and you know, I feel like that could be debated less and less every day.
We lost touch with that ancient history.
Well, not only lost touch with ancient history, but lost touch with tradition, lost touch with cosmology. Is like, we don't have a story that puts us in a specific place within our environment. It's like, we're kind of, from the cultural narratives, like, we're kind of on top and everything else is below us, and everything else is like made for us to use.
And we just kind of popped out of the ether and, somehow, and nobody really knows.
Right. Well, yeah. However it happened, it's just like, what are the stories that we tell ourselves? Where a lot of like traditional cultures is like they're a part of the whole, not standing on top of it in like a pyramid form where all these things are there for their disposal or for our disposal. So it's like, how do we change the cultural narrative? I think is the biggest thing. And I feel like that's where, to me, the alchemical perspective and the mycological perspective, and the psychedelic perspective have the most potential, right? Because if you take those things and kind of like we were just talking about with the microdosing psilocybin, if you take those things and you use them within the context of the cultural narrative that we're talking about, and you're just kind of driving your egoic force forward, and you're just trying to make those bucks, and you're trying to kind of capitalize the best that you can on your environment so that you can put more into your pocket, you kind of, from my perspective, like missing the point.
You've lost it.
I feel like it, it's like, I feel like there's a lot that we can learn from traditional cultures and models where we're inherently a part of everything else, right? And so it benefits us to live in harmony with the natural world and with our ecosystems that we are a part of, and with the societal structure, than having divisiveness and kind of like this dog eat dog mentality that is ultimately, from what I can tell, put us into a lot of the problems that we see in our societal structure.
So you see alchemy, and then just how mushrooms work in their own self, being like a community and like a network. We can look at that and mirror that and shadow that in our world, and make our world a place where all of us, all of the humans, are together in one beautiful, harmonious, conflict-free, I should say, situation.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know if a utopia like that would ever exist, but
it's coming.
I feel like there's still probably going to be conflict, but the ways that we address that conflict and the ways that we approach it can be more harmonious.
Right. See, that's the thing. It's about responding and not reacting. If we can get to a point where every human responds to each other versus reacts, then when conflict does arise, we can diffuse it in a way that's harmonious.
Right. Well, and then, and take a note from the mushrooms is like when you've got an abundance of, silica piled up, then you can share it with that person over there who needs some silica, in the context of the mineral. Yeah. So, it's like, how do we work on ourselves too? So speaking from like a personal level, the alchemical framework has really been a guiding force for me, because it's how do I live within and relate to the natural world in a way that in a way that really feels good and resonates with myself. So on a less meta level than kind of where I took it with that first answer, it's how do we apply these things to our lives so that we can individually be the best human beings that we can be, right? Within our smaller circles, and then theoretically, ideally, maybe that kind of ripples out from there.
So let's see, we got some time. We got 12 minutes. So I just want to talk about, what are some of the things you want to leave people with that are going to strengthen their understanding of mushrooms, get them away from, did you make that word up? What was that? Fungal phobia, or what was that word?
I didn't make it. Yeah, fungal phobia.
Was that Paracelsus?
Not Paracelsus, nope. Yeah, just the fear of mushrooms.
How do we? What can you tell people to help them understand more that mushrooms are just like a vitamin, almost like just something that's from nature that will benefit them? What will get them over their fungal phobia?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest thing is that most mushrooms aren't going to kill you, right? Even the poisonous ones, there's only a handful that if you eat them, they'll kill you, and most of the time, people aren't eating those mushrooms if they don't have, and won't be even close to eating those mushrooms if they don't have a relationship with the mushroom realm. So my first advice would be to just don't go out and eat mushrooms if you don't know what you're getting yourself into. If you go out with somebody who's experienced, more than likely that person isn't going to feed you something that's going to kill you. At the very worst, it might give you like a little bit of an upset stomach, which is not the end of the world. However, all these mushrooms that we're working with medicinally, none of those are anywhere close morphologically or chemically to anything that's going to kill you or cause you discomfort, unless you have a very, very rare mushroom allergy, which is like a very, very small percentage of people.
Buddha.
What's that?
Buddha.
Yeah, Buddha.
Isn't that what happened to him?
I don't know.
That's what I heard. That's the story, from what I understand.
That he died from eating a mushroom?
Well, he did not want to refuse. Someone offered him a mushroom that he was allergic to, this dish that had a mushroom in it that he knew he was allergic to, but he didn't want to participate in the energy of refusing this person's hospitality. Right. So he ate the mushroom and died.
Crazy. I'd never heard that before.
That's the Buddha story.
Huh?
Yeah. So very rarely. You might be Buddha, but very rarely, but
if you're getting mushrooms from a reputable sport, now you're scaring people again.
No, we're back.
If you're getting mushrooms,
ancient times.
If you're getting mushrooms from a reputable source, you don't really have to worry about that. And all the medicinal mushrooms, especially like the conch mushrooms, right? You don't have to worry about them being deadly, because there's not really deadly conch mushrooms, especially ones that are being used in natural medicine. So
right.
So
that was just like thousands of years ago. This guy was like picking stuff out of a field. There was no health regulations. They didn't have OSHA.
I think it's a great it's a great story though too, right? Because don't just take random mushrooms from some dude who hands you mushrooms.
Am I smarter than Buddha? Am I smarter than Buddha? Because let me tell you, I would have said no. No offense. I think the guy would have got over it. Like he might have went a little too far on that one.
Yeah, but So yeah, I think there's not really much to worry about when it comes to taking mushrooms, and so I think generally we have moved past that fungal phobia in large. I think there's still probably a handful of people who hold on to it.
Sure,
but I think by and large as a society we've kind of moved past that, and also we're kind of seeing not only a renaissance in the alchemical traditions, but we're seeing an even bigger renaissance in the mycological sciences, right? So a lot more people. I feel like when I started making these medicines and started giving them to people and kind of like describing what they're for and all these kinds of things, it's like a lot of people were like totally new to it, hadn't even heard about it, it was kind of introducing them to a whole new wormhole, to where these days it feels like every other person that comes and talks to me has not only like a foundation of like, oh, well, I've heard mushrooms are good for you, but also like, I know that you should be taking the fruiting body over the mycelium grown on grain, which is kind of like a debate within the medicinal mushroom world. But
which one is more medicinal, essentially?
The fruiting bodies, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and so there's a couple things that set our products specifically apart. One being that they're all fruit body extracts. There's benefits to the mycelium for sure. However, I haven't seen one piece of research that validates mycelium grown on grain as being as effective as pure mycelium or as the fruiting body. So, if somebody has that research, I'd be more than stoked to see it and more than stoked to look at it, but I just haven't seen it to this point. So we work with the fruiting body, and also from a kind of like an energetic perspective of herbalism, right? It's like the fruiting body has all of the extracellular metabolites in the forms of like the terpenes and the things that give it the flavor. And so if you taste a handful of different mycelium products, they all taste pretty similar, especially if they're grown on grain. They're like a little bit sweet. If you take an extract from a fruiting body of the mushroom, you're going to taste the different mushroom in each of those. So each of them are going to taste pretty radically different from each other. And from an energetic system of medicine and working with natural medicine is like that flavor, like that bitterness that you get from a reishi fruiting body that you're not going to get from the mycelium is going to kind of like trigger the intelligence of your body, and it's going to kind of activate your body's own innate intelligence. So along with the compounds from the mushroom working, you've also got your body kind of like turning on and tuning in to help itself as well, right?
It's not dropping out though. It's dropping in to help you.
Dropping in. Yeah. We've moved beyond dropping out.
Well, the thing is that like, wow, so all your products, not only are they the highest quality spagyric extraction method, you're also using the fruiting bodies.
And all of our fruiting bodies are coming from North America, primarily the Pacific Northwest. So that's the other thing, is when you find mushroom products that are coming in the form of the fruiting body or the fruiting body extract, is they're coming from China most often. And I think that there's a couple sides to that. And I think one argument that I've heard people make, which I'm not sure is necessarily something to worry about, is but the quality of regulation around like organic standards and production quality, and then irradiation as getting those imported into the United States. But then for me, the bigger question is a question of ethics, right? Because I know in China that they don't have the same stringent labor laws that they do as they do in the United States.
Well, the communist doctrine does not teach morals and ethics. It says the word ethics. They don't even teach that.
Right. So often I ask, and I'm not sure, maybe there's really well-to-do, I'm just curious, because the price for Chinese mushrooms is a lot cheaper than you can get
just like any other product.
For sure. And whether that's a volume thing and that they've just dialed in, I mean, they have been cultivating mushrooms for a lot longer than people have in North America. But I also feel like that price is being paid somewhere else, whether that's like industrial waste or standards, or whether that's somebody's wages and whether somebody's being paid a living wage. And I think when it comes to medicine, I think, to this point, things have just been kind of trending and people just kind of take whatever's trendy. But I think moving forward, one thing that we should consider too, when we're talking about and thinking about natural medicine and medicine in general, is like, where is it coming from and what's the price? And if I'm trying to heal myself, do I want to kind of settle with the cheapest option, or do I want to kind of step up and feel good, not knowing not only that I'm taking the best thing for my body, which is, definitely can be difficult to find the best quality extract, but also, am I taking something that is benefiting the larger community too, right? And is not detrimental to somebody.
The human community.
Right. So it's like, am I putting money in the pocket of somebody down the street so that they can feed their family and that they have more money to feed themselves and put back into the local economy? Or am I sending all that money over to China,
which is an oppressive regime,
which has its own implications,
full of beautiful people, but there is an oppressive regime. And well, they talk about that in the crystal world. I have friends that are gemologists,
sure,
crystal rock hounds, I guess they call themselves, but they talk about the same thing. You're getting these beautiful minerals, but are they coming from China? Are they dug up in these unethical, environmentally unsound ways that destroy the environment? And then they send slaves, potentially children, in to harvest these minerals.
Right.
And then they end up at the Tucson Gem Show for like these super cheap prices. You're like, whoa, and because of the energy behind it, and a lot of the people that are sensitive, that care about these things, as we all should, don't accept those minerals because of the energy of the extraction, the energy. And you're saying the same thing can happen to these mushrooms that are coming from these oppressed places where they're using slave labor and they have no environmental standards. All of that energy is in the mushroom. So if you're trying to heal yourself, you're trying to use these mushrooms to reactivate the healing energy in your body and work in synthesis with the mushrooms, you want to have the best mushrooms, not the ones that are made by slaves in an industrial setting in China.
I mean, I would say so for sure. I can't speak to any of the companies that are getting their mushrooms from China to say that's exactly what's happening, but there is the only excuse I've heard for why people won't transition to using North American grown mushrooms is the price. And for me, it's like, that's kind of a cop-out to...
It's a scarcity mindset.
Yeah.
Are you scarcity or are you abundance? We talk about this on the podcast before in previous episodes.
Sure.
If you have a scarcity mindset, you're worried about having your little bit of money. You're getting unethical products in order to save this little bit of money, not opening up to the infinite abundance of life and the universe and the divinity of everything and saying, well, I'm creating an ethically sound product, therefore the resources will come into play to make me successful.
Right. As opposed, can I sell it cheaper and make an extra 20% on my margin, right?
Right. Yeah. You want to have the products to attract those type of people. And
yeah, I think it's kind of like an old world approach. I think that there's a lot of transitions happening beyond the alchemical world, beyond the mycological world, to a standard of ethics and how we live on the earth, and I think maybe a lot of that is coming from them. But yeah, I think we have a lot to learn and a lot to think about, and also, you know, it's a scarcity mindset. But when you're exporting all of that economic wealth out of your economy to another economy that doesn't benefit, you know, what's the difference between that and between putting it back in? And then maybe that's where that scarcity is, like that scarcity mindset's like creating even more depravity, because then you just sent out all that
you're
money.
feeding it. You're feeding it. It's creating itself. Whether if you kept the money in the community, you trusted, you had faith, which we talk about so much on this. You had the absolute faith, then it would all work out, because your products, like you said, you have local fruiting body mushrooms, all Northwest. It's the highest quality products that I've ever seen in this realm. It's mind-blowing to me. And, you know, if people are hearing this and they're super excited, as they should be, I want all of you to go to www.feralfungi, F-U-N-G-I, feralfungi.com. Look at these products, because they're going to help you. They're going to elevate you. They're going to do more for you than similar products that you might already have. This is exponentially higher quality. And I often say, if you're going to do substances, if you're going to eat food, if you're going to take whatever you're going to take, make sure it's the absolute highest quality. And that's what I feel about Feral Fungi. I feel like it is the absolute highest quality, and I give it my highest recommendation.
Well, thanks, man. That's it's a big compliment.
Well, I'm very excited to be here, and I just want to thank you. As we close our podcast, I just want to thank you, Jason Scott, for being with us, and we hope to have you on again as this podcast develops. You know, we want to touch base with you to get the alchemical perspective on various things that may develop as time continues, and also the mycological perspective. Is that okay? Can we bring you back on in the future?
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like it was a really fun conversation, and we just skimmed the surface of a lot of different topics, and we could probably make whole episodes out of each and every one of those topics, and then peripheral topics to those. So
I'm down, and we can go for as long as we want. I'm going to bring a lunch next time. We can sit here for 4 hours. We can have an incredible time. But thank you so much, Jason. On that note, I guess we're out of here. Midnight on Earth.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, bro.